Alright, actual recording time. Let's see what happens. Alright. Hello, I've come to answer a question, one that I have asked actually. Why must the autobalancer in Sector's Edge change? This is more of a technical number video and an especially long one, so get your clipboards ready. Before it was implemented, around early to mid 2020, players had two options when joining a lobby: fight for Helix or fight for Aegis. In this, once a side was picked, the players would be able to change sides by opening the player menu, default keybind tab. Later, the autobalancer was implemented and refined over time to what we have today. It is first worth mentioning that the autobalancer is relatively new, and that it was most likely implemented in early to mid 2020 after the video source that you saw before, and therefore, as of making this video, it is around 1 year old. For a one-man coding team, due to needing to work on other parts of Sector's Edge as a game, it makes it understandable that it cannot be the main focus. While I understand this, I think it is very important to revisit it due to the following reasons. Starting with the goal of any product, which is to retain the consumer, the autobalancer is probably one of the first things the player interact with when they play the game, physically joining a match. Due to this, as well as how it governs matches, it needs to be very adept at either keeping the game as fair as possible, or at least do something match-defining other than moving players around. Reason being that if you cannot retain the player's interest, due to being entirely outmatched by the other team, these players might leave and never play the game again. As of right now, when I talk to various people within the community, I see a very common message. The autobalancer is quite confusing, does some really strange player placement in certain lobbies, especially smaller ones, of which means that in a game where there isn't always a full lobby, the autobalancer is quite important for player retention. If a team feels like they can't play, they will leave. If the winning team doesn't have players to fight, they will leave also. This means it needs to be adept at handling such types of lobbies. Lastly, an important note is that generally speaking, not always, in a closer match, having one extra person on one team compared to the other will make the game favor that team with the extra player due to the respawn timer being a static value, and the extra bit of granularity having more players in a match gives. Ooh, this leads to the next topic. Starting with what I teased you moments ago, the first thing the autobalancer should manipulate is the respawn timer. The easiest way I can see this working to negate the previous problem mentioned is to take the number of players on a team, factor in some other nonsense to gauge which side will start winning, we'll get into that later, as well as considering the player count on both sides to then reduce the respawn timer by a few seconds, but definitely not more than half. If it's too much, especially in the edge case where it's a lot of newer players versus a few experienced players, this could give too much advantage to them, so plenty of testing would be needed. Example of this manipulation within game modes, it could be something similar to the following. Starting with the rectangle zone controlling game modes, both break for their own control zone. Affecting the ability of the losing team to change the zone would be a good idea due to, if that team's not able to be on point that much, their effect of being on it should be increased slightly, similar to what happens to balance out a lack of players. Similarly, in Salvage, a simple change to how it currently works in zone control game modes would be consistent. That is all. Salvage is the game mode that IMO needs the least tweaking. It's the oldie but a goodie, I guess. Huh? Lastly, for Escort and future Object Mover game modes, a change to how the team can manipulate flags would be a good idea. When a flag is delivered or captured, there should be a cooldown on when it can be picked up again. A cooldown of 10 to 20 seconds will allow both teams to reposition themselves to keep the game going for longer, and to allow weaker teams to strategize slightly better and with less pressure. This value could also change depending on whether the flag's team is consistently dunking flags like baskets, of which the cooldown would be increased, or the opposite for the losing team. Probably include a blurb for this feature so people aren't confused though. Unfortunately for arena game modes, I really got nothing. They're good for comps, but I can't really think of any good way to auto-balance them since they're so simple in nature. Larger matches maybe for Mayhem? I don't know. Not really a topic for this video. Moving on! While the ideas above are great and will definitely help the game modes be more fair, the autobalancer algorithm itself needs to be more precise. I have a few ideas for this. Firstly, a different tweaked autobalancer for different game modes to take into consideration their objectives, which are very different, is important. In this, it needs to look for other things than just the ability for a player to kill another player, and so on. But what to look for? Starting with the Capture the Zone game modes, tracking each player's ability to stay on the objective is important. A mechanism I can think of is to keep track of an average to count for the player's playstyle. After this, compare the average to the current value, and once this is done for each player, average it out for the team. Using this, compare it to the opposing team. If this value is drastically different, it's quite apparent that that team is losing and thus needs some help in terms of when a new player joins. Additionally, this should aggressively swap one or two people from both teams, depending on their aforementioned stay-on-point ability on average. This should in hypothesis allow the losing team to have a more experienced player to help them capture the point in a situation where they are completely outplayed. For the Object Mover game modes, a similar method should be employed, but less big brain. A basic premise is to look at each player's ability to stay within the escort range of the flag, and use this algorithm as mentioned previously. Using this mixed with seeing if the team is dying a large amount while trying to cap the flag, especially when the other team has captured more flags than the other team, to then do the aggressive swap like mentioned before, but with these statistics instead. On another note, for the sake of teaching players about the game if they are new, having a feature available to players below level 20 by default to have a hit marker persistent on screen to tell them where the current objective for their team is. Reason being that they might not understand the map layouts very well yet and might be lost. In the tutorial, make sure to mention this, as well as that it disappears past level 20, as well as that where they can disable it. For players above level 20, this should be grayed out and unusable, unless you can think of another reason to keep it for more experienced players. Lastly, in multiple parts, as this is extremely important to factor in, is performance. This goes in multiple parts: ping, packet loss, desync, as well as frames per second. This will not take into consideration average compared to otherwise, as statistics numbers are, well, static values that are absolute. To calculate the importance of frames per second, it's worth noting this. Stutters are a thing, and the easiest way I know to calculate this is to look at the 5% low average frame rate, and in this will determine the stuttering. If this value is not equal or higher than 60, this means two things. First of all, on another note, FPS instability sticker would be nice for people without statistics overlays. On top of this, for the AUTOBALANCER, an exponential increase in importance as it gets lower would factor in the FPS weight. Reason I'm not saying average or concurrent frame rate is because the 5% low will show the worst of that average, and that means the frame rate they are currently getting cannot be lower than this 5% average on average. Maths. Now, for the networking ones, this one is more simple. Ping should be weighted to some degree, but as a multiplier to the other two, as ping tends to pronounce these effects more or less. Onto these two, a basic calculation with an exponential importance as it approaches whatever value is basically unusable should be factored in. They should be factored as individuals, as this will most likely affect a single player more than a whole group. In this should factor in primarily when considering who to swap, because you don't want to give the losing team some kids who are having internet problems who can't really play. Starting with the simplest, the player's ability to kill. It should be factored in at 20% due to this relating primarily to the player's style, while still important, less important than the other factors. In terms of the ability to stay on point, they should be factored at 40%. Reason being that the ability for the player to do the tasks the game mode asks for is literally the name of the game. Lastly, for performance, as this generally makes player worse than otherwise, they're rating 40%. In terms of how this calculates out of a 100 score, less than 100 means the player is performing on average worse, and higher means the player is playing better than average. When comparing teams, as this is an average versus an average, whichever with a lesser average within a small tolerance should be assisted by the AUTOBALANCER. With the current state of the algorithms in play that quietly determine the fate of a match, it is quite important to make sure that they are as fair as possible, taking into account as many factors to calculate. Rather than thinking the AUTOBALANCER is an RNG deity that determines your path in a match, it should be the old reliable that is hard to climb as a concrete wall. You shouldn't be able to blame the AUTOBALANCER as long as it's doing its job well. Thanks for watching this video. If you do like this style of content, feel free to watch more of them. A lot of videos I've been making recently are scripted, so yeah. Dang. I got that done quick. Before it was implemented, before around... I guess that's actually how it's supposed to go. Starting with the goal of any product, which is to retain the consumer. Starting with the primary goal of any product, which is... If winning team doesn't have players to fight, they will... If the winning team does, as well as considering, I made a typo. Alright. R is. Thank me. Alright. Lastly, in multiple parts, as this applies in my opinion, is bruh. How do these stats weigh in the AUTOBALANCER? Starting with this. Thanks, phone. I should do bloopers. What's a good idea? Yeah, I'll do bloopers. Anyway,